This is the Agoro Carbon Farming Podcast. Agoro Carbon Alliance is taking action on a global scale to reverse the effects of climate change by decarbonizing farming and restoring carbon to the world's soil. On this podcast, we're going to explore carbon farming from the soil to the atmosphere and how it affects everyone in between. To learn more, visit us at agorocarbonalliance.com. Hey, thanks for coming back to another edition of the Carbon Farming Podcast with Agoro. We are going to talk about carbon farming again today from a different point of view. We're going to bring in the university point of view here today, and we have someone that we were lucky to get, Alejandro Plastina. He's associate professor of economics at Iowa State University, and he has a unique and great background for this. We're going to get into that, but Alejandro specializes in agriculture production and technology with an emphasis on farm business and financial management. His research that he's done there is focused on socioeconomic drivers and conservation practices, voluntary pest resistance management, and carbon programs. So we welcome him. And to help out, we actually have an Iowa State alumni, Craighton, who is an area sales manager and agronomist for Agoro Carbon. He's joining us here. He covers the Iowa, Minnesota, and Missouri areas, and he's passionate about agriculture and environmental sciences. So welcome aboard, both of you. Alejandro, just to get started, give us a little bit of your background and how you got involved in the carbon marketplace.
Well, thanks, Scott, for this opportunity. I've been studying the socioeconomic factors leading to the adoption and disadoption of conservation practices in the U.S. Midwest for 6 to 7 years now. But I only started to pay attention to carbon programs a couple of years ago, at a time when farmers in Iowa were getting the first round of invitations to join multiple carbon programs. So in 2021, I co-authored a number of extension and policy reports comparing carbon programs, describing the evolution of carbon markets, and analyzing the viability of future markets for carbon contracts. I also was selected as a 2021 Farm Foundation Agricultural Economics Fellow to conduct research on carbon farming, and that opened the door to insightful conversations with industry leaders and government officials about these carbon markets. In this year, I co-authored 2 peer-reviewed publications on challenges to voluntary agricultural carbon markets and potential scenarios for carbon farming. So I've been also very active in doing presentations around the country, and a few international presentations also on carbon markets. So I heard different perspectives from around the country, from different stakeholders, and even from international players on carbon markets. And I look forward to having this conversation in this podcast.
Alejandro, with your background in financial management and agriculture, when you first heard about the carbon marketplace, as people were starting to make these offers to farmers and ranchers in Iowa, what did you think? Did you think this was voodoo science and that it was a waste of time, or did you think right out of the gate that this was an opportunity for farmers and ranchers?
Well, the first thing I recognized was that I did not know enough to make any assessment. So I contacted my colleagues in other departments at Iowa State University and starting asking questions about the potential from a science perspective, right, on actually creating these carbon credits or carbon offsets and insets, and the science behind measuring and quantifying these carbon sequestrations or emissions avoidances and so on. And then I started looking into the economics of those decisions, right? What are the main socioeconomic drivers of the participation in these carbon markets? And of course, the financial aspect is a major aspect, but it's not the only one. People want to participate in carbon programs, not just because of financial aspects, but also to enhance their conservation practices. Regenerative agriculture generates environmental benefits, and finding other ways to finance the adoption of more conservation practices and more regenerative practices seems to resonate well with some farmers.
Yeah. Hey, Clay, you're a graduate of Iowa State. Were there any classes when you were going to school about carbon sequestration or carbon farming when you were at the university?
No, not directly. Anyways, back then it was still kind of in the infancy stages. It seems crazy to think it's been over a decade now since I've been there, even now too, which is a bit wild to think about. But no, no exact classes. And but when I was at Iowa State University, I varied between animal science, environmental science, agronomy, ag business. Tried to make myself as well rounded as possible. Well, I think some part of my background for that is kind of what brought me to this unique space of ag like that too. So it's interesting to be able to help farmers in this respect.
Yeah. Alejandro, so after you heard about this and you kind of validated it with some of your colleagues, you started doing some research on the subject of the carbon marketplace. What kind of research did you do and what did you learn?
So we started comparing different carbon programs, across a number of characteristics. So everything from how carbon credits are created according to these different carbon programs, what's the permanence requirement of a certain sequestration of carbon, or whether their additionality is required or not to participate in the program, what's considered additional and what is not. Multiple aspects of this menu of carbon programs offered to farmers, and then what's the break-even cost, or what's the break-even carbon price to actually participate from a financially viable standpoint in these carbon programs. And that's my current focus right now. So we are looking into the potential financial benefits of participating in different carbon programs at different carbon prices and different levels of costs for different practices. And you can participate in carbon programs through planting cover crops, through reducing the intensity of tillage practices, through reducing the stocking rate of livestock production, reducing cropping in marginal croplands, and switching into permanent pastures, applying nitrogen through following best practices, and changing from commercial fertilizer to compost. There are multiple ways in which farmers and ranchers can participate in these carbon markets. And the question for me is, what are the price points and the costs where it's financially viable and desirable to participate in these carbon programs? But again, I recognize that that's not the only variable behind the adoption decision or the decision to participate.
Yeah, I think you're right on the money. I mean, if it doesn't make financial sense, you're not going to get a whole lot of adoption out there. I'm curious, Alejandro, from your standpoint, working for the extension service, is it becoming more talked about? Are growers and ranchers, are they interested in this topic? Is it something that has become a topic of the conferences and the field days that you're doing?
Very much so. The interest in this area has grown exponentially over the last 2 years. More farmers are interested in learning about what can be done to participate, what are the risks, the potential benefits, and how public programs can interact with these private voluntary programs, and how they can manage risks over these long-term contracts. Most of these carbon programs require that farmers sign a multi-year contract. So in order to do that, farmers need to have an idea of how to manage risk over the life of the contract. So yes, we get lots of questions about carbon programs. We get lots of requests for presentations, and not just here in Iowa, but as far as Delaware and North Dakota going to southern states also. We've been covering the topic for multiple stakeholders, and domestic and international.
Hey, Clay, I'm just curious. The risk that Alejandro talked about and these long-term contracts, boy, that kind of seems scary to me. As you're talking to interested parties, what do you tell them about the risk or these long-term contracts? Should they be aware or scared about these?
I think it's more being aware. And when I try and explain this to growers, I try and be as transparent and forthcoming as possible, because there's already enough fog in this space. It's my job basically to make sure the grower is comfortable with what they're signing up for and they know what they're signing up for. And with Agoro, we also have various payment options and everything that have a little bit more leeway with some of these contracts. So with us, we were able to kind of personalize a little bit more to the grower, I feel like. So it's my job, like I said, to make sure they understand that, they understand the ins and outs. If they get out all the what if scenarios. So I do my best to try and, like I said, clear the fog, so to speak.
Yeah, Agoro Carbon Alliance is not a fly-by-night startup. It's backed by one of the largest farming companies in the world, and we're here for the long-term haul of this program. But I want to talk to you, Alejandro, a little bit about the role that universities play in this. I love the fact that you said universities don't have anything to sell here. You're doing the research. You're listening to growers. You're getting a lot of questions asked of you. What is the role of universities in this whole carbon marketplace as you see it?
So I see two major roles here. The most immediate one is to provide objective information to our stakeholders, discussing the pros and cons of carbon farming and conservation practices for each particular location, understanding the interaction between public and private programs, incentivizing these practices, and also contextualizing the role of carbon farming in extended carbon pricing schemes when renewable energy and forestry are the main competitors to agriculture. Now, the second role that I see, this is more long-term, is to conduct research to actually expand our knowledge about the dynamics behind carbon removal and emission avoidance in the agricultural sector and their interaction with soil carbon storage and soil health, as well as other environmental services like water quality and biodiversity. So both extension and research are very important.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I guess the question I have is now that you've been working in this area for a few years, is it right for everybody? Should all growers consider doing some kind of carbon farming or carbon sequestration? What's your opinion on that, Alejandro?
Well, certainly, this is a case-by-case question, and I would say I would invite every farmer to consider these carbon programs, but it's completely up to the operator to decide whether it makes sense. It makes sense for them, right? So, the realities of a farmer in a hilly area with irrigation are very different from a flat, very productive area, dry land, and particularly if they produce two different types of crop rotations. So the programs should make sense to each farmer, and that's why evaluating the potential for carbon sequestration by practice and county or farm specific local area is so important. We cannot really make these blank statements about that carbon programs are more likely to work with this type of rotation or this area, because the realities of farmers and ranchers are very different, even in the same neighborhood, right? So we have to be aware that changing practices is costly to farmers, and since the buyers of the carbon offsets or insets want to pay only for carbon credits that would not have been generated without those payments, they require additionality. And therefore, the farmers would only qualify to participate in most carbon programs if they produce additional changes in their operations. And that's costly. The reason people stick to their practices is because they have the knowledge base to keep their rotations going. They know when to plant, what chemicals to spray, when to harvest, and so on. Once you start tweaking those parameters, then there's a learning curve that must be faced, and farmers will have to relearn a few things and adapt to the new technologies, right? To the new processes. So since it's a costly process to start with, you can only expect that farmers who see value in incurring those costs will eventually participate. And that might be different. How farmers perceive value might be different for farmers that share the same fence.
Right.
So.
Right. And Clay, really, that's your role. I think Alejandro brought up a really good point that this might not be right for everyone. And so you sit down with anyone interested and help them decide whether it's right for them or not. And then I think one of the most important roles of the Agoro agronomic team is they're going to help the grower through this learning process. If they're left out on their own, and most growers are very adaptive. They're able to make changes and learn and adapt to whatever circumstances. But if you have somebody that has some experience like yourself, Clay, to hold their hand, I think that they minimize the learning curve. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of what we like to promote. I mean, it is a case-by-case basis, but it also is my job to make sure somebody's comfortable. Like, for example, if a grower's been all conventional, like never even thought of cover crops before, I'm not going to suggest, hey, let's do no-till and cover crops and everything right off the bat. Like, Let's do a walk before we run type thing too. And it all depends on their comfort level and what research have they done? Are they looking for a recommendation from us? Are they looking for a nitrogen fixing like cover crop? What are their familiarity? So it is refreshing for me. Like, I do phone calls basically all day and text messages, emails, but every case is different. And it's interesting to see, okay, where is this grower at in his conservation farming journey, basically. So I do think it's my job to do that and then to continue on with them too. Like, I'm not just going to sign you up and leave. Like, any questions at all, I'm always here. And we have a full grower success team too to help through the rest of the way of that too. So I think that's kind of what makes Agoro different in that respect, is that we're here and we're with you through the entire journey, and you can always add on more acres and more practices as stuff comes along too. So we're here for the long haul, as you said before. So I urge all growers to, anybody that's listening, is do not self-disqualify yourself beforehand. Like, make sure you have a conversation with somebody like me or anybody first, because even if it's not Agoro, maybe a different program is the right fit for you. Just figure out what's right for you, and at least, toss the line out there and see if there's something that's right for you.
Clay, tell us from your perspective, how important is the university's involvement in this carbon marketplace?
Oh, it's very important because it helps validate. Because like you kind of alluded to earlier, like these carbon markets, is it all snake oil or voodoo or something like that too? Like, where's this money coming from? So when you have the backing of a university and research, and okay, we've actually done the science base behind this, and you can share that with growers and show the proof, and that just helps validate what you're trying to do. Like, we're not trying to sell them, a certain product or anything like that too. We're trying to just partner with them as a program to figure out what's the right move for them. So being able to validate what we do and how we do it is essential. And with the help of Iowa State University and other universities that do it, just helps, get our word out there a little bit better, more concrete.
Great. Alejandro, I hear that you've done some research into cost-sharing programs in order for a grower to increase their cover crop usage. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we looked at federal and state level programs, particularly for Iowa, in terms of facilitating covering the cost of adopting cover crops. And the regulations change, and we have a new big package of regulations coming through the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. But in general, there are plenty of opportunities out there for people who want to start testing the cover crops in their farms, EQIP being one of the largest programs. But there are also state-level programs incentivizing the adoption of cover crops, and even subsidies to crop insurance for using cover crops. And that's a big change from what we experienced a decade ago, or even a few years ago, where cover crops were penalized under the crop insurance system. So now farmers who choose to plant cover crops, they receive a $5 subsidy to their premium. So there are multiple programs in place, and of course, not all programs are available for in all states, but for farmers interested in adopting cover crops, I recommend doing research online for NRCS programs, and also contacting the State Department of Agriculture. And we've also learned that there are opportunities through NGOs, at least in the state of Iowa, where some private corporations invest in these local programs to incentivize cover crop adoption in specific areas, usually in the production of specific food crops, or in specific watersheds to improve water quality in the area. So there are multiple opportunities and programs to learn about cover crops, to receive cost share, and end up with a lower net cost to those who want to test cover crops. Of course, these programs don't last forever.
Right.
They have a maximum period where you can participate in these programs, usually 3 to 5 years, but that's enough time to face that steep learning curve that sometimes is associated with planting a new crop.
Yeah. And there's a lot of different programs. I love the fact that there are programs out there that ranchers and farmers can take advantage of. And if I were a betting man, Clay, I would bet that you have the finger on the pulse of all of those programs for the states that you cover, and the Agoro Carbon Alliance team is well aware of the programs for the states that they're over. Is that could we rely on you, or do we need to go look at all the websites and do tons of research on Google?
I mean, if you want to, more power to you, but that's what we are here for too, is to help, like I said before, is kind of translate and clear through some of that fogginess that too, for, okay, if you're in this program, can you also be in a carbon program? If you're in X, can you also include Y, so to speak? So yes, so area sales managers like me that help work with our contract, we were able to clear through that with the grower and figure out, okay, what can you dual enroll with? What can you stack basically together and everything like that too? So I think it's important for us to be able to clarify that, just so everybody is aware of all the opportunities available to them.
Great. There's so much talk going on, and it's increasing every year about the carbon marketplace and all the different companies that are involved, and what do you need to do, and like you said, Alejandro, the risk and the learning curve. So there's a lot of information out there. In the state of Iowa, there's a couple resources that we'll link in the show notes. But one thing I was not aware of, Alejandro, and you mentioned before we hit the record button, the Carbon Sequestration Task Force for the state of Iowa. Can you tell us briefly about what that is and why we should know about it?
Well, I think that's specific to the state of Iowa, as you mentioned, and it was a task force implemented by request of the governor, Kim Reynolds. And the idea was to collect facts about carbon sequestration, what we know and what we don't know about carbon sequestration, and in particular, to conduct an assessment of the potential for carbon sequestration and carbon markets in the state of Iowa. And there was a big involvement of Iowa State University, but it was not just Iowa State University. There were contributors or collaborators from many different associations and stakeholders in the state of Iowa. Iowa State University produced a report, a big report covering everything from the hard science to economics of carbon sequestration to the sociological aspects of farmers' perceptions about carbon sequestration, and that's available in the Iowa State University website that you mentioned in the materials.
That's great. Thank you. And before we end, there's also an event that's coming up in January in the state of Iowa. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And of course, include a link in the show notes on how someone can register and attend that.
Yeah, so it's in the state of Nebraska. It's in Omaha, January 6th. It's a train the trainer full day session for any educator or people who speak about carbon sequestration and try to communicate about carbon sequestration. This is organized by the North Central Extension Risk Management Education Center, and we are collaborating. So Iowa State University is collaborating with North Dakota State University and the University of Nebraska-Lincoln to generate the content for that conference. And the idea is to not only educate, but also provide the educational materials that can be replicated anywhere in the country to educate farmers, ranchers, and have deeper discussions when thinking about carbon farming.
And I've heard that the conference is being held indoors where it's heated, so you don't need to worry about Omaha weather in January. It'll be a nice place to be instead of out in your field. Clay, in closing, if someone is listening to this and is interested in learning more about the Agoro Carbon Alliance or anything that has to, if they have questions about the carbon marketplace, where would you suggest they go?
Yeah, our website, agorocarbonalliance.com, does a good job of advertising how they can get involved and hear more. And also we have a carbon farming knowledge hub on there that has work from me and all of my colleagues for any podcast interviews, papers, everything we've written for as much material as we can provide growers to do some research on their own to see if it could be a right fit for them. So yeah, I urge you to take a look at that and feel free to give me a call.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. Alejandro, thank you for all the hard work that you've done in supporting this. I think that what we've learned over the course of many podcast episodes that not only is this good for the farm and the ranch itself, but it's also good for the soil. It's good for the overall cropping system and the future of farming. So thank you very much for coming on and give us your perspective from a university and what you're doing to help promote this. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Scott.
You've been listening to the Agoro Carbon Farming Podcast, where we bring you knowledge on how to sustainably and profitably transform farming through carbon cropping. To learn more about how you can become a partner, visit us at agorocarbonalliance.com or follow us on our many social media channels, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn.